Good evening, everyone. Welcome to COVID class. I am here with my guests, Dr. Veronica McComb and Dr. Janelle Carter Robinson, as well as my co-host, Dr. Taylor Newton. Glad to have you with us tonight.
I'm still muted, and now I'm not muted anymore. Dr. Fisher, I believe that welcome screen is still up.
And I am trying to figure out how to make it go away because I don't see where it says, there it is. I moved my my dual monitor setup down in here to my basement office just to make things easier, and it looks like it just made things more complicated. So
I think that's the story of the summer, though, right? We try to make
Yes.
things easier and they just become more complicated somehow. But this evening, I think we're going to get complication, but in a good way, right? So history is not about telling simple stories. They're not just about here's the simple story and here's the moral, but instead it's really understanding people. So here we are back to the humanities in this class. So our last foray with the humanities was Dr. Gary Johnson way back in week 4. And this evening, I'm thrilled to be able to dip our toes back into that aspect of a liberal arts exploration of the coronavirus pandemic this evening. So as always, we're going to have a brief mini lecture from our guest professor for the week, which I'm super excited about. And then we are going to jump into some question and answers, and we would like for you to help us out with that. So we know you've got excellent questions after engaging with Dr. McComb's course content for the week. So please share them with us. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we're also monitoring the YouTube chat feature too, if that's easier for you to ask your questions. We might not be able to get to all of them, which is unfortunate because there are always great ones that we have to leave on the table every week. But luckily for you, if you want to, you can continue the conversation tomorrow on YouTube when we make this recording available there at that time.
Our guests tonight, I'm going to take just a point of personal privilege to say something about our first guest tonight, Dr. Veronica McComb. I'll give you her formal bio here, but I want to say that I'm super excited to have her here because she has become a trusted colleague and friend over the past almost a decade now that we've been working together. Her office is just across the hall from mine, and we are always back and forth asking questions, trying to figure stuff out about our students and how to help them learn better. And I cannot say how excited I am that you have joined us tonight. So thank you for being here. Dr. Veronica McComb joined the LR faculty in 2011, currently serves as Associate Professor and Program Coordinator for History. Her PhD is in American and New England Studies from Boston University, and her BA was as a senior fellow in Film and Television Studies from Dartmouth College. Her doctoral work focused on the influence of religion on the immigration experiences of Nigerians in the United States. And it was generously supported in 2009 and 2010 by the Charlotte W. Newcomb Dissertation Fellowship for Religion and Ethics from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. As the 2015 and 16 Lenore Rhine Faculty Teaching Fellow, Dr. McComb developed pedagogical expertise in the flipped classroom. Her broader research and teaching interests include race, ethnicity, and immigration, media studies, African diaspora studies, and digital storytelling. She is the former director of the LR Honors Academy and incoming dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. She will be joined tonight by a special guest who, again, I'll take just a moment to say how much I appreciate Dr. Janelle Carter Robinson being here with us. Although she will only be joining us this one evening, conversations with Dr. Carter Robinson have really informed a whole lot of what we've been doing this summer, and your input there has been welcomed and appreciated. So thank you for helping give some shape to what we're doing. Dr. Janelle Renee Robinson, a native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and here we go, Steelers. that hurts this Eagles fan to say that, but I'll give it to you. She earned her PhD from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, PA, in counselor education and supervision, has over 10 years of clinical experience counseling individuals, children and adolescents, families, and couples. She has also served as a therapist on several wraparound teams coordinating effective treatment for children and adolescents. Dr. Robinson facilitated several support groups for seniors and individuals coping with grief and loss. She has provided supervision to master's level students in a number of master's programs throughout southwestern Pennsylvania. Dr. Robinson has been part of an ongoing project in Haiti providing training for mental health practitioners and spent 4 years as assistant professor at Alabama A&M University in Normal, Alabama, where she served in a variety of capacities, including the director of clinical training. She's developed online classes, 3 online classes for 100% online delivery, has served on various thesis committees, advised the freshman mentoring program, and was a faculty mentor for a project assessing mobility issues in predominantly African-American communities surrounding the university. She joined the Lenore Ryan University faculty in August of 2019. She is the program coordinator and assistant professor of the KCREP accredited clinical mental health program on our Columbia, South Carolina campus. And she is the author of Many Strides to Freedom, African-American Women's Unsung Contributions and Legacies. She enjoys spending time with her husband, Travis, and 2-year-old son, Ezekiel. So we'll have a chance to hear from her in just a couple of minutes, but first we're going to hear from this week's guest professor, Dr. Veronica McComb.
Thank you, Devin. First of all, I want to say, take a moment of privilege and say just thank you for inviting me. And part of the reason why I agreed to this for this summer was the opportunity to be able to work with both you and Taylor. You're some of my favorite people on campus. And I'm sad that COVID might keep us from being able to go across the hall too close to one another to exchange ideas. But we'll nonetheless have been able to communicate and exchange ideas virtually as well. And then I met Dr. Robinson virtually just last week, and it kind of made me sad that it took me this long, even though she's been here since the fall, to actually meet her, because the conversation with her definitely was good food for my soul. Just good people all around to be with this evening. I wanted to start this evening not so much with a history lecture, but sort of some framing comments about history as a discipline, right? I find that with at least my students, people come in with a very specific understanding of what it means to study history or what history is as a discipline. And that it's largely informed by their kind of familiarity with it in high school. And that way it becomes a really polarizing kind of subject to study where people either love it or they hate it. One of the main reasons why they love or hate it is that history is just a bunch of facts, and some people love those facts. Some people adore those pieces of trivia and are really great at pub trivia and are like the kind of anchor to their team in that regard. But then other people who may struggle with memorizing all of those things may say, it's just not for me for that reason. When history is really just so much more than that, right? The other reason that I find that people really love history, at least students who come to me and want to major in history, is a storytelling dimension. And that's actually how I did fall in love with history as a discipline, especially when you're talking about weaving together lots of different lenses, lots of different stories, and just how complex and messy it really can get. I started off my weekly lesson by talking about the fact that I was a cultural historian. So I want to talk a little bit more about what that actually means as a way of contextualizing my viewpoints for this evening. A cultural historian is largely, as a cultural historian, a social historian as well, I'm largely interested in sort of communities, identities, and the way that people make meaning of their lives, their beliefs, their customs, what they value, those kinds of things. And in that regard, I'm also much more of a microhistorian than I am a macrohistorian. So a macrohistorian would be somebody who's interested in these sort of big kind of dynamics that are happening in history. And I've got a colleague in our department who mainly focuses on economics in that regard, for example. I'm much more interested in the stories of very small communities and individuals and the ways in which their choices and their lives were impacted by those larger dynamics, or that they maybe themselves impacted those larger dynamics in history. So, for example, it was really fascinating for me to move to Hickory and learn about the polio epidemic rather. Of course, we're talking about pandemics, so the sort of global disease spreading. And so I had a few comments that folks were like, well, you know, there's a polio epidemic in Hickory as well. And that was really interesting to study and learn about when I moved here. So like whether it's the hospital that was raised up by the community, the kinds of dynamics between whites and blacks during a segregationist era, yet they were taking care of the community at the time. Those kinds of stories are what fascinate me most about history. Like, I am interested in the war efforts, yes, like what's happening on those stages, but I'm also interested in what individual people are doing and the agency that they have while history is being made around them. I'm also a migration historian. And so I'm interested in movement of peoples and the choices that they make to move to or away from or come into new communities. And I think that that's a particularly important lens to look at the pandemic that's happening right now. When we're looking at past pandemics, for example, some of the dynamics that were having people move about were war efforts, colonization, exploration, missionary work. These are things that brought people out of their normal environments and into new environments. And of course, if they're carrying a contagion, be it one that they themselves have developed immunity from, like the case of smallpox with the European immigrants or European explorers that came to what is now the United States and spread to the indigenous people. The kinds of things or reasons why people are moving to different places also influences the ways in which contagions are spread throughout the world. And so that also, in many ways, if you had read the Alan, I can't get his name right, Kraut article, leads to what he considers to be the other pandemic. So when we're linking these specific diseases and the spread of these diseases to specific people or places, then that can lead to a considerable amount of xenophobia. And so I know that there's a lot of interest in discussing that a little bit further in our conversation. So I'll stop right there just to give you a sense of where I'm coming at with my perspective for our conversation this evening.
Well, yeah, you know, Dr. McComb, I found that fascinating. That you got us to think about the idea of this other pandemic as increased prejudice and xenophobia, and how it played out across history, right? So the Jewish people for the bubonic plague. I didn't know that cholera was blamed on Irish Catholics in some, especially New York City. It seemed like that was where it was really. Recently, I remember swine flu, so-called swine flu, was blamed on Mexican immigrants. And then, of course, Asian immigrants for this most current pandemic. But one thing that really struck me was that the Spanish flu was pointed out as something of an exception to that xenophobia. So xenophobia wasn't really one of the outcomes of the Spanish flu. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about our current pandemic and the xenophobia that's happening as a result of that compared to the Spanish flu, because it feels like a lot of the things driving the lack of xenophobia in the Spanish flu, so like the idea of a very global society and that it's hard to pin it on exactly just one set of people, or the idea that the world can kind of come together around certain issues. There seem to be some similarities between now and then, or maybe there's not. What do you say? Ooh, are we frozen?
Oh no, it looks like Dr. McComb's video is totally frozen.
My question was too all over the place.
I thought you were just getting a stare, like, I'm not sure what to do with this question.
I don't know what and now do we have to answer it ourselves? Oh dear Lord, Dr. Robinson.
We throw it to our other guest. Dr. Robinson is going to answer it for us, right? Or it looks like maybe we have Dr. McComb joining us again. But I'm wondering if
I was like, did I do something wrong? They booted me out already.
I think we're just going to attribute it to my all over the place question and move along. I'm not sure where you lost the Spanish flu versus now, xenophobia versus not. How is that playing out?
Yeah, I think the key difference there is that the Spanish flu was also happening during a world war. And so the folks that were coming back from the war efforts in Europe, especially the soldiers that were coming back, it wasn't seen so much as a kind of an ethnic influence and a way to be sort of leery or weary of the other, so much as it was something that was affecting kind of the brave people who fought on our behalf. So there's that. And then with this particular one, I find it interesting that the origin of the, or at least patient zero, whoever patient zero is, we're tracing it back to Wuhan, has caused the xenophobia, when in fact, kind of we've been the major kind of, I wouldn't call it a problem, but a considerable source of spread.
Right.
Let's say that, right?
Yeah.
So even though there's this movement towards labeling it as the sort of Chinese, the fault of the Chinese, it's really just, it started, and I would definitely blame those migration patterns. I think that's also something that I wanted to mention in my opening comments, but it just slipped my mind because I figured, like, let's just get to the conversation. When we're talking about past ways in which we moved about the world, we were talking about, first of all, we had limited means of doing so compared to what we have now, right? So we had land and water essentially, and now we've got air. And not only are people moving for the sake of trade, they're also moving for leisure. So you have a lot more people who can afford, both in terms of time and in terms of financial resources, to go different places in the world. So it's very, very easy for a contagion to be developed in one part of the world and then be picked up and brought to other parts of the world if it's not detected fast enough.
Gotcha. Another thing that I was thinking about a little bit, and this may be wrong, is like I kind of have maybe a romanticized view of what our country was like in the 1800s and the early 1900s as like that melting pot. And I think I've heard it described as like a melting pot myth. Like I imagine like all of this, we're all coming together, coming to America, like Fievel the movie kind of a thing in the back of my mind.
That movie too.
Right. Why can't we all just be like Fievel?
Right.
So, and that's what I was imagining when I was thinking, oh, the xenophobia isn't as bad for the Spanish flu. And it's worse now because, I don't know, we have a perception that resources are running out, all the jobs are being taken by these immigrants, and that's the nicest way to put it. Mm-hmm. Is there any validity to that, or all myth?
It's all myth, really. It's I think that, well, first of all, about Fievel, I think that we have to remember that one of the very first songs in that movie was "There Are No Cats in America," and of course, there are cats in America. And so, even in that movie, the sort of the myth versus the reality come face to face, very much so, and it's all about struggle and whatnot. In terms of this sort of blaming of immigrants, I think it does go back to that kind of fluctuation we have in the United States about being isolationists versus really wanting to engage with everyone in the world. It's sort of, as long as there are positive things coming in from immigration and those things are being highlighted, there are periods where there's less pushback against immigrants. But of course, the moment that something negative does happens, and suddenly it's sort of latching onto those specific examples as a scapegoat instead. I mean, if you look at really, and this is becoming so cliche, if we were looking at the heritage of most people in America now, even if you were to trace back several centuries, as long as you're not an indigenous person and 100% indigenous, we all immigrated or migrated to this land in some form or fashion. So whatever it was that our families and these communities have contributed, it's sort of the success of America is accumulation of the success of many generations of immigrants. Right. So if we were to look at it from like the long view, then we really have a lot to owe immigration as opposed to demonizing it in any kind of way.
Gotcha. But yet somehow we manage to forget that lesson all the
Oh
time.
yeah, well, it's easy when once you're here and you've kind of got your stake of the land and of the resources, then the tendency is to say, well, we don't want any others to come in and take those things. We have become part of the us, of the we, the people, and so therefore those other people infringe on the possibility of our success, and that's simply just not the case. Unfortunately, it is also the kind of branding we've done very well of promoting out to the world. So if we're really interested in not having so many immigrants coming in, we should stop telling people that we're the land of opportunity.
You can keep your huddled masses. We're not interested.
Everybody wants opportunity, right? And if we're going to be that kind of country, we got to be open to what comes with that and who comes with that, right? Because lots of people come with very valuable gifts and resources.
And then we have our own baggage, which kind of leads me to another question that I'm hoping maybe Dr. Robinson can help us out with here. And Dr. McComb, you were just talking about some of the names that this this pandemic has been given. And it seems like if we're not careful with those names, that the name itself can open the door to xenophobia. And we've heard that from the very highest levels of leadership, right? So Dr. Robbins, your area of expertise is in microaggressions, one of your many areas of expertise, and that seems especially relevant to that issue. Can you speak to microaggressions in the context of this pandemic?
I mean, absolutely. And so I don't want to dare creep into Dr. McComb's area of expertise as far as just history in general.
Lots of overlap. Fantastic.
most of my like all of my research is in the Black community and microaggressions within the Black community and how it impacts folks, just on an emotional and on a mental level. But just in general, I think that when we're thinking about microaggressions, because it's what it means. It's those small utterances. And so when I think about that in the current climate, it's just like, what are the effects that it's having on a whole group of people, right? And so you meet someone and you say this very racist, remark to them, but you say it in such a subtle way that it's not outright, it's not super, overt, but it still has such an impact on them. And so what happens, like a lot of time within the Black community, is that continues to happen because there's been microaggressions within the Black community since, we've been in this country. Or were brought to this country as slaves anyway. And so what that has done is there's a lot of historical and transgenerational trauma, right? And so if we're not able to even be aware of that and stop that, you're going to have the same thing where you'll have a group of people that are traumatized because of this current pandemic, and comments are being made because of xenophobia and because of ignorance and all of these things. And then it'll affect an entire group of people. And then that will get passed on to their children and their children. And now you have that trauma that gets continued to be passed down. And of course, that's, you don't want that for anybody. And it's so difficult because I think a lot of times the people that say the microaggressions or they're doing them, they often don't realize, because again, like you said, Taylor, if things are coming from the highest, place in our country, then it's almost like this is a very accepted thing to do, and it's okay to say these things and these very racist things. And so, I didn't know that I couldn't say that, or I didn't know that was, wrong to say, because if this person can say it and they, so yeah, it can be, it can be devastating. It can be very traumatizing for folks.
Can I say two things in response? Just made me think of Dr. Robinson. One is I value the work that you do, right? One of the things that we struggle with most, especially as microhistorians, is when we're thinking about the motivations and the feelings and the emotions behind people, because of course, what we think and feel is informed by our current context. And if we're talking about historical context, we can't immediately extrapolate how we would feel about something in 2020 and connect that to how somebody would feel about something in 1920 or 1820. But at the same time, that ability to tap into those emotions, to really think about and ask those questions is kind of fundamental fundamental to understanding the motivations of historical figures, and as we kind of collect all the documentation that we can, and then fill in the rest with like, well, let's try to really exercise what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a muscular empathy. And he uses this in different ways in social contexts, but also in historical contexts, to really dig deep and try to figure out as best as we can, connect with those emotions of other people that are unlike ourselves, be it because of difference in our own time or just in a different time period altogether. But then what else you said about trauma, I was reading this book today, in fact, called Bandwidth Recovery by Sia Veer Sheldon, which is all about sort of reclaiming the cognitive resources for students from marginalized groups that have those resources that have been lost to racism, social marginalization, and poverty. And the first couple of chapters of that book are about physical health and mental health. And one of the things, I was trying to pull the book and pull out the quote because I found this really telling and really connected to what you said, was this idea that there's not only trauma that happens, but then there's a sort of a physical manifestation of the daily stress of having to like almost be on your guard, aware, and sort of navigating life in a way that folks who have a greater sense of cultural capital may not have to be on that edge as much. And so there's more that I could say about that book because it's absolutely fabulous, but that's exactly what it made me think of when you were talking about sort of generations of trauma.
Absolutely. I mean, stress. I don't know a medical doctor, who does not understand the significance and does not talk about the significance of stress on like high blood pressure and, like heart disease. And I did not go to medical school. So please don't, but I think we all know that, right? We all know that stress does things and, it impacts us. And so, when there's been a lot of conversations about just everything that's going on, especially, again, I go to just the Black community because that's where, my work is, but, between COVID and then between race, systemic racism and things like that. And just, okay, so this is what we have to make sure that we're doing as a Black community, because we already know we do have these extra stressors, right? When you have an oppressed, and no matter who, whatever oppressed community, that whether it's racial oppression, and now we're dealing with this whole, just the ignorance of this pandemic that we're dealing with. And so just emotionally, the toll that it's taken on folks, and then how that's turning into maybe some medical and like physical challenges for folks. And so again, and I remember I was talking to a student. It was a Black student, and we were talking about, I teach a diversity class, and we were talking about microaggressions. And I think he said something along the lines of, well, I've never like experienced racism, right? And so as we continued to talk, it was this, so when you're thinking racism, like no one's ever called me the N-word, or I've never experienced those like overt, racist attacks, but as we started to talk more, like, oh, well, this did happen to me, or that did happen to me, right? And so even when you're thinking about microaggressions, again, it's sometimes we don't even know that things are being said because of that. And once you start to kind of realize that, again, just it's devastating emotionally, kind of to your self-worth, your self-esteem, and then just all that kind of, it just really impacts like the entire community.
I'm really interested. One of our audience members, Karen, points to the fact that what follows the Spanish flu pandemic is the Roaring '20s, and wonders historically, is there a connection there, that shift from moving out of one thing to the next? And I want to add too, kind of based on the conversation that we've just had, we think of that as a time of prosperity, but I'm guessing it was not for everyone. Mm-hmm. And that not all communities recovered from the flu pandemic into something super prosperous. Mm-hmm. But then the follow-up question that Karen brings with that is what do you imagine might come from the current pandemic? And I love the way she wrote this. How can we expect the era to come to be formed or mauled or energized by the COVID pandemic?
I love that.
And if we can, I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we might break that down even a little bit further and not think only nationally, but also different communities that have been affected by this.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that question. Is it Karen?
Karen, yes.
Karen, thank you, Karen. I So the Roaring Twenties is, I think that Dr. Fisher definitely hit the nail on the head in terms of prosperity. It's not general prosperity for all. If anything, you see a greater sort of difference and gap between the haves and the have-nots. And then a decade later, the Great Depression makes that all the worse. Yes, you have everybody kind of experiencing a level of loss in many, many ways. But then you have those that were already impoverished, deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched in poverty and taking a much longer time to sort of recover from that from generations afterward. Um, in terms of what is, to account for that, some historians, economic historians, relate that to kind of the sort of war, prosperity, kind of crest, what's that? Crescent, something like this. The wave, yes, let's just call it a wave, where you have a period of relative financial struggle, and then you have a war, and then you have a period of financial prosperity, and then a period of struggle, and then a war, and then prosperity. And so that definitely followed the pattern between the sort of 1900s to 1920, and then 1920 to 1930, and then 1930 all the way through the end of the Second World War. In terms of what's to come after this, I don't know. The world is very different. And so I'm a 20th century historian, and there have been some significant cultural and technological shifts that have happened in the last 20, let's just say 20 years, from 2000 to 2020. And so what exists now and the resources that exist now to more people, um, definitely it creates an almost democratizing force. Now, I will say that, but I'm also going to say that those who do not have access to things like technology and aren't able to view or watch this conversation this evening, for example, that's going to create that, again, that great divide between the haves and have-nots. So you're going to see folks who are impoverished, again, deeply entrenched in poverty, I think, as a result of our continued and growing reliance on technology as a result of the pandemic. But what you also might see is, I think, a greater return to the concept of the home. So I think that we moved into a period of like everything is outward, whether it's out in cyberspace or it's out and about socializing with people. And now we're at a point where we're forced to be in the home and evaluate and basically deal with one another, whoever is in our home. And if we don't have a home, what does home mean? And so I think that you're going to see a lot more sort of reflections, social and cultural and artistic reflections on the concept of home and belonging, right? And safety and security. And that was one of the disclaimers I was.
Oh no. Oh dear. I really
Uh,
wanted to hear the end of that sentence.
I did too.
Ah.
But I do wonder, Dr. Robinson, I wanted to hear from you as well on this one. So maybe as Dr. McComb gets logged back in, what do you see? You said a couple of times that your work is particularly on the Black community. We've heard from others, and you've talked about the fact that the Black community has been affected disproportionately with COVID-19. Do you see anything positive, or is it going to be, as Karen put it, mauled by by what's going on and what's happening right now?
If I can just be completely honest, I have moments where sometimes I am like, oh boy, like I get because I think when you know so much and you've seen so much, and I have a 90-year-old grandfather, right? So when he talks about, and he is good, like, and is sharp and everything, when he talks about things, it does not sound that different than what we're going through right now. And it makes me so sad, and I know that there have been changes, in laws and things like that. But what I will say is, I do think that technology has been great for that and just kind of bringing attention and bringing awareness to certain things. And so because, we do have, news 24 hours a day, though it is not healthy to watch news 24 hours a day just because it's on. But, because we do have access to, the world, I think just having that attention on the Black community, like, yes, this is what's happening in Detroit and this is what's happening in Flint, Michigan. And so what I think it does is it galvanizes people. And so that's what I'm hoping that it does. And that's what I am seeing that it does. I just think that, you have to be persistent, right? Because it's difficult to change things, right? Because there's things that are systemically in place. And that's how you have oppressed communities that have remained, oppressed for centuries and centuries, because systems have been put in place to keep it that way. And so, as we continue to get that that attention just stays on it, and people are coming together and people are galvanizing, and people are just tired. And so I think as that continues to happen, that makes me extremely hopeful, right? So as long as people can kind of keep that energy and having enough people, because it is exhausting, if you just kind of have a faithful few and each community, and all of that goes on him. And I'm always going back to self-care and mental well-being. And so as long as someone is not burned out and exhausted, but if we can galvanize as a community, as a nation, whether you are personally impacted by it or not, but if you see injustices happening, and so that makes me hopeful, is that you have enough people that are upset and they want to make change and they want to see change.
So do you see a clear connection then? And this is, it's a question came to mind for me, but it's also one coming from an audience member, Ruth Hoffman. Are you seeing something hopeful in the connection between the Black Lives Matters movement, the facing of our monuments right now that's happening, and what are the connections between those things? It feels like there is a connection, and maybe that's the question. And does that connection give us anything to hang our hats on, something to be hopeful for? And I think I'm not sure that's directed to anyone in particular, but whoever wants to weigh in.
I want to respond to Dr. Robinson's comment. First of all, I don't know why I keep getting kicked off. I think there's somebody out there that is like, this, to heck with this Dr. McComb character, is kicking me off. But I'm going to take a little bit of, wouldn't necessarily, I guess it's a pessimistic view. I am a card carrying optimist by nature. But at the same time, the very same thing that I'm seeing happening with the pandemic, that's happening with the kind of resistance to the notion of Black Lives Matter, has to do with the concept of altruism, right? So to galvanize, you have to be able to want to serve the good of others over yourself, right? This may not be something that's directly affecting you because you're not part of that community, but you care, right? And you want to make a difference. You have to have a lot of people that care in that way. Likewise, with what's happening with the pandemic and the whole mask controversy, you have to care about other people in order to get behind the idea of wearing a mask and know that it's not about you, right? It's about protecting others. And so unless we have, so backing up, as a nation, our national identity was not built necessarily on altruism. It was built on independence and individuality. It wasn't even built on community. It was built on the idea of a single person could come to this nation, have rights, and succeed. Not that a community helped them do that, not that a person helped them do that, but that they did that themselves, to sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps concept, right? And until we integrate the notion of altruism into what it means to be American, we're not going to see a whole lot of change or movement in a positive direction, in my opinion, just looking at the historical record.
It seemed like there were echoes of that in the readings that you assigned, Dr. McComb. So it talked about the minority ethnic communities coming together in these ways, forming communities and communication amongst their community that were effective. And there was tension there, but that they were able to come together and move in a positive direction. So it's really interesting that y'all are drawing these parallels between Black Lives Matter and the experiences of the minority ethnic communities historically, especially for the Spanish flu. That's great. So kind of related to that, that tension between individualism and community of some of these ethnic communities. My heart broke a little bit when I was reading about the immigrant families who are very community oriented, being warned not to kiss their children, not to mourn the dead according to their cultural customs. And then they were shamed in some ways for not complying with those health warnings, maybe rightly or wrongly. I don't know how I felt about, maybe there's no right or wrong. It's just, it is what it is. But could you talk a little bit about individualism coming into conflict with altruism, with a community focus today?
I think you had a diagram from a recent study that was done on our community. Do you want to pull that up?
Oh, except my screen sharing is disabled, Dr. Fisher.
I can't see how to enable it. Do you want me to pull that up? Or actually, I'll just make you host again. We've been bouncing back and forth on who's hosting this meeting. So.
Dr. McComb
working through that. I think even if you're not talking about this from an ethnic perspective and ethnic customs, right? I think one of the things that people are struggling with in terms of wearing masks and social distancing is it goes back to that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It goes back to this need to connect, this need to belong. And that could be expressed through specific customs from a culture, or it could just be customs and practices and gatherings that are particular to your family and who you consider where the community in which you belong. And so in that regard, that individual need to belong is coming in direct conflict with that altruism. But at the same time, like case in point, we had a period of time where we had to social distance from my in-laws who are in the age group that's high risk, right? And so it was really, really difficult to say, because I love you, I can't be near you, right? And because I love you, I can't hug and kiss you, right? And I can't imagine, God forbid, that anyone in our family ends up contracted COVID and then having to self-isolate for a period of time, especially with my little ones around. It's going to absolutely break my heart if I ever have to do that. But to understand, I guess it's like thinking about the long game, right? In the short term, we will suffer because we can't connect and express our sense of belonging the way that we want to. But in the long term, you know, as my mom likes to say, this too shall pass. And this is what will allow us to be able to hug and kiss and reconnect again in the future. But it's really, really hard when those kinds of customs are deeply entrenched in whatever kind of culture that you practice, whether it's a family culture or an ethnic culture. Absolutely.
Yeah, so what we're looking at here, this was just published, this just came out today, a case study within Catawba County, the county that Hickory, North Carolina is located in. Many of us are from this part of the country. Our county public health director, Jennifer McCracken, published this example of community case spread, exactly what you're talking about, Dr. McComb, and it harkens back to what I think Dr. Gary Johnson was talking about when we were talking about literature. He had us read an article that talked about all the pathways that this virus follows are all the same pathways that we show love and affection for one another. And so looking at this case study, this spread, it's just, it's heartbreaking in so many ways, the challenging a notion of who we are, and that immigrants, I think it was mostly Italian immigrants were the focus of that one article that you had us read. They face the same challenges. Do you think our culture is going to shift as a result of these experiences? Did they shift historically? Did people become less? Did that custom of kissing the dead, did it go by the wayside in part because of the pandemic? Did other things change, and will they change for us? Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I'm not sure about that specific custom, but if I were, I mean, we also have to look at the length in which the pandemics last, right? So I don't think there are a few of the pandemics that we looked at that lasted several decades, right? But you're looking at thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of deaths in a long amount of time. I think the length of time has a lot to do with it. So if you have to modify the behaviors for a long period of time, that of course has, I think, sort of a ripple effect as to whether or not that changes future generations. In the case of like the Spanish flu, or hopefully what's going to happen with COVID, where you have a year or 2 years of major disruption to daily life, and then it's over. I'm not sure that's long enough to cause major changes in human behavior in terms of their customs, unless, of course, we deal with mutations of the disease that then have us kind of chasing I keep waving my pencil around because I talk with my hands and I'm like, now I've got a pencil. It looks like I'm
She's a
waving
professor,
magic
ladies
wand.
and gentlemen.
Yeah. If it has us chasing the disease in terms of vaccines and things like that, that might be something that forces us to modify human behavior. And so that we are no longer high-fiving. That's not a thing that we do anymore. Or shaking hands, right? I thought about returning to the fall and how customary it is for me to shake hands with new students, with parents, with new colleagues that I'm meeting for the first time, and that now for this fall, I have to cease doing that, right? If this lasts long, the handshake might not be a thing anymore. Or again, the high five might not be a thing anymore. But I think that's really how long the disease is going to last and have us kind of having to modify our behavior.
Well, let's say though, even though if it ends today, it probably would not have long lasting, and it's not going to, we know that it probably won't have long lasting impacts on the way that we do things, but it will have long lasting effects on our mental health. I can already see this in my family. And Dr. Robinson, what would you say about, what advice would you have for us? What would you say? You've got experience counseling families and children and adolescents. I've got all of those. How do we do this?
Yeah, it's a challenge, and I think that for everybody, it's gonna look different. I think what I'm seeing, just like you, Dr. Fisher, is like family members that are high anxiety because they're watching too much news, and even
Guilty.
Like. And then it's like different news. Now I'm like you, Dr. McComb, with my hands. And it's like different news sources. And so this, news source is that, and then this one says that. And now you have all this anxiety, and now there's fear, and then there's depression. And so counselors, like therapists, therapists cannot not even take on the amount of clients that are coming to their practice. I had a friend of mine who has a private practice here in Columbia, and she said, I can't, there's so many people over the past 2 months that has come wanting counseling, like I can't even take them all, so now I have to start to refer people out, because it's just that fear of the unknown, and it's the anxiety, and life is changing. And so, you're at home all day. I don't know that you spent that much time with your husband or your wife before. I mean, all day. Usually you see him in the morning. All right, have a good day. You see him at night. And now it's like we see each other all the time. And then, you have folks that are, and I know you guys have Dr. Funfausen talking about just like the mental health aspects of it in general later on. But, you turned into teachers. And I don't have a degree in K through 12 education, but because you have, school age children at home. And then if you miss an assignment, I have a cousin, she has 3 children, and then she was feeling guilty because something didn't get done or she didn't know how to do it. And so I definitely encourage everybody to just, the self-care, just, really trying to create healthy habits, really trying to create boundaries. Just kind of giving you're not perfect. Things are not going to be perfect. If that assignment doesn't get done for your child's school, that's okay.
Good.
Teachers will understand that maybe you haven't taken algebra in 25 years and, everything's new for you as a parent. But yeah, just engaging in self-care, I always tell people too, like being able to like talk to people, see someone face to face. The good thing about the time that we live in is we have Zoom and we have FaceTime and we have, Microsoft Teams. So we have all of these programs in which we can definitely feel more connected to people, because we are, even though, we have so many people in our society, and like Dr. McComb talked about earlier, you have some more people that can be more individualistic in that sense and more collectivist. And so some people that definitely are from that kind of collectivist culture, this can be really challenging. But even the folks that aren't, I mean, just to kind of be in isolation for so long, just can be mentally draining on anybody. So, it's just like staying connected as much as you can. If you know someone that lives by themselves, especially elders, like check on them, just call them. You don't want to put them in danger, but call them on the phone or something, and just really just try to take care of yourself the best, because it's new and you don't know how to navigate this, and so you have to figure out what works best for you and what works best for your family too.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've definitely noticed that I'm hoping is something that sticks, that something does change in terms of our culture, is how important grace has become, right? Yeah. Having grace with yourself and self-compassion, but then how gracious people have been with one another, right? Because none of us have done this before, right? And there's like very few people that were even alive at the time of the Spanish flu. And if they are, they're probably, just kind of sitting back and like, don't come see me. I'm okay. I don't need to do this again. But just the idea that, there's so many parents that are struggling to be teachers and do their jobs, especially if they work full time or have several jobs, right? And one of the things that has saved me as a parent in that regard is reading about or listening to other parents who are in that same struggle, to know that I don't have to be perfect. I could do the best that I can, and that's all I can ask. And then with my neighbor who's struggling, to be that support, that sounding board, and say, I hear you, I feel you, I understand you, and it's okay if you need help. I can help you, and I'm sure that you would do the same for me as well. So I'm hoping that's something that does stick and leads us more to that altruism, right?
It's a great example of storytelling. Storytelling is one of the things that can kind of help us to figure out our way through this. And history does that, and literature does that. And Dr. Robinson, I think you just gave us a really great advertisement for week 9, which is going to be Dr. Ryan Lewis talking about connecting in times of crisis. And for week 10, Dr. Fufhausen really digging into mental health. So we're really, I think, are we starting to tie it together? Are we doing the liberal arts interdisciplinary thing? Like that. Okay, so I have another question for both of y'all. So to a certain extent, Dr. McComb, you alluded to this before, Americans are kind of becoming personas non grata in the rest of the country. To a certain extent, we're experiencing a little bit of othering, probably rightly so, but that's the experience, that we're not being viewed in a very positive light nationally, for people who don't want us in their borders. And do you think that experience might help us to exercise that muscular empathy that you're talking about, Dr. McComb? Experiencing that?
Yeah, I think so. In some ways, I think that we have enjoyed many decades and a couple of centuries of being a major world power, and being able to throw our weight around in a lot of different ways, economically, politically. And I think that this is one of the very first times that we might experience what it's like to not be the favored sort of nationality or identity, right? And I think that is really important to building that altruism that I talked about, to know what it feels like to be othered and to not be wanted and actually turned away. We haven't experienced that much in our nation's short history compared to a lot of other countries with much longer histories. And so I'm hoping that is so. I mean, it also takes a certain kind of leadership to guide the national consciousness in that direction and become aware of that, right? Because they could have the reaction of being very defensive and then becoming isolationists again and saying, well, we're not the problem, the rest of the world's the problem, right? And there are those opinions that exist in our country. And it's one of the great things about being this country is we all are free to have our opinions, right? But in terms of how our government acts and how the rest of the world sees us as a result, it's really going to take leadership to kind of cultivate that way of understanding, hey, this is what it's like to, we're not very well liked right now, and maybe we deserve it a little bit. So let's kind of rethink some things and maybe make some changes that will help us and help the ways in which we engage with other people in the world.
Do you feel like that empathy, I mean, Dr. Robinson, you talked with optimism about what Black Lives Matter is doing for people to experience or to empathize with the experiences of people of color. Is it about developing that empathy for what reaches people versus what puts us into that defensive mode that Dr. McComb was just talking about? Is there a parallel there?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that and we talk about that a lot as counselors, right? It's just that as a counselor, a client can come in. I will not be able to have the same experience that every single client comes in. Like there will be clients coming in, and you may not just culturally, you're different, experience-wise, you're different, sex, sexual identity, all of that kind of stuff. But when we talk about being empathic, I mean, we talk about that throughout our students' master's program and how important that is to fostering that therapeutic relationship, and how it can put you. So for example, we had class last night, and one of my internship students is working with sexual predators. And so one of the questions that, was asked, like, how do you not kind of have that reaction of, looking at this act that you did and it's horrible and all of these things. And it's empathy, when you're able to look at a human being and not look at their actions, or, when you can see people for who they are, we're all human beings. I think that definitely can assist in maybe trying to understand someone else's experience, again, that you will probably never truly understand in that respect. You'll never maybe be able to go through it on the same level as they will, but being able to develop enough empathy where, again, we can have some change that really starts to happen.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Got time for one more question, really. And I think before I ask the question, I want to acknowledge something that Anne-Marie pointed out in the Q&A line. And I think it's really the whole discussion tonight has helped me to think through the fact that really we are a nation that is informed by pandemic, and that we started with pandemics, that the original immigrants to this country brought with them diseases that really decimated Native American populations. And I think to not at least pause to acknowledge that in this conversation would be a mistake. And I do think, I think I want to wrap up with a question here from John Hall, and this brings us way back local, and that's to the polio epidemic from the 1940s. It is such a part of the identity of Hickory. I drive downtown and I see the murals, and the question is, I'll just read you what John wrote, and Dr. McComb, if you can say something here, that's great. If not, I think acknowledging the connection to our local history may be enough, because I don't want to presume that the texts that John mentions in his question. So I don't want to put you on the spot too much. He asks, you mentioned the polio epidemic in Hickory, and I'm interested in the difference between our community and the communities mentioned in the Race and Politics of Polio story concerning Warm Springs, Tuskegee, etc. Also notes that, and this was something I didn't know, the story continued for years after the 40s epidemic, including a lawsuit against the Hickory League for the Crippled that ultimately went all the way to the Supreme Court. So anything you can say here to the connection between what we learn about pandemics historically and what we can learn locally from the Hickory response to the polio epidemic?
Actually, I think when we're talking about different, because I have family in Massachusetts, so let me back up and say that. I have family in Massachusetts. I know a number of friends who live in New York. So, and then my neighbor, her family lives in Michigan. These are all three places that have been hit very hard by the pandemic, right? So lots of things are happening globally, and then these sites have been especially hit. North Carolina, we're just getting that on a much smaller scale. Numbers are climbing, yes, but they have not reached the scale of New York, Massachusetts, and Michigan, right? I think the difference with the polio epidemic is that you had lives being affected in a major way on a larger scale locally, and they were affecting children. And somehow age does make a difference in terms of people's kind of need to care. You know, children are exceptionally vulnerable. And we as a culture, I think just the United States in
Oh no. Ah. I feel bad for you people in the audience out there because you probably won't be able to hear the rest of that amazing thought. Whereas Dr. Fisher, Dr. Robinson, and I are totally going to call up Dr. McComb after this and talk with her about it. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Dr. Fisher, can you tell us a little bit about who we're going to be hearing from next week?
We're hearing from Dr. Lures next week. Is that correct?
Next week is going to be Dr. Shore, Dr. Mary Shore.
Dr. Mary Shore.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm skipping a week. It has been a long week. It feels like it's been 2 weeks this week for me, so I'm jumping ahead. Yes, Dr. Mary Shore is the rector and dean of the Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary. I got it right, which is associated with Lenore Ryan University. She's going to be talking to us about the question of theodicy. So how do we explain the presence or not of God in a pandemic? And we will have the privilege of being joined by one of our seminarians down on the Columbia campus who will be with us as part of the conversation. So Dr. Shore, if you're listening, I'm sorry I skipped over you because that's a conversation that I'm really, really looking forward to.
Same. Oh my goodness. Yay. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Robinson. We'll thank Dr. McComb later. Y'all have a great evening. Thanks for being with us here tonight.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.